Because our enemies controls the information that we receive, this allows them to control what we believe. They have exploited their monopoly of information that we receive to limit our knowledge to a radius that keeps us from obtaining information that truly liberates us. Through this process, they have dumbed down the minds of many of us to believe that our collective mindset, where of which many of us think in ways that serve the system of white supremacy, is the result of a silly slave syndrome myth. Those who believe that silly myth does so because they are ignorant. Because that myth presents what would in fact be the least effective method used for controlling generations of people. It's simply not how true brainwashing is achieved. True brainwashing requires the systems being constantly reapplied upon the minds of a target population in order to be effective. Usually people have the right to believe whatever they choose to believe. However, there's a profound exception to this rule when it comes to the oppressed. The oppressed must gain a clear and accurate, concise understanding of our plight and condition. The oppressed must function based on what is actually true. Because if our understandings of are flawed, then all liberating remedies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. The oppressed must function based on what is actually true in order to develop the proper solutions necessary to liberate ourselves. This is in fact the reason why white oppressive forces have fed so much disinformation into our communities. They do so to prevent us from gaining the true understanding of our plight and condition that's required in order for us to develop the proper counter strategies that are necessary to liberate ourselves. This is why they spread so much disinformation to our communities. And this is also why those of us who know the truth must teach. African proverb. Here's the hidden truth of our plight and condition. White social scientists determined that the unprecedented unified black protest demonstrated during the 1960s was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of that decade's Black Pride movement. They also determined that black collective aggressions had erupted against the white society due to the ongoing blatant white racism. This was also happened during the 1960s. So those white social scientists determined that they could subdue black unified protests by keeping the collective self-esteems of black people very low and by keeping our collective aggression shifted away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves through propaganda campaigns. To achieve these objectives, they started deploying a demoralizing, divide and rule psychological warfare propaganda against black people. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality is much more than just a biased media reporting. It's actually an insidious black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. This is the fact. Demoralizing divide and rule is the method of maintaining control over a targeted population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds a people, and they can then be ruled over forever. This is the truth of our plight and condition. People can be easily controlled by the information they routinely receive about themselves. When people are constantly fed positive and affirming information about themselves, this raises their collective self-esteem. This unifies them. Now, it doesn't matter if the information presented is untrue. Most people will act upon it because they've all been given the same information. Information warfare. Now, however, when people constantly receive negative information about themselves, the opposite happens. They become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and they become more compliant with the oppressor's dominance over their lives. This is the warfare. This is exactly what's being done to black people. In fact, when people are demoralized, they'll in fact prefer their oppressor's dominance over their lives. It also creates self-hatred and disunity, which attack the core foundation with bonds of people, and they can be ruled over forever, like I said earlier. And again, it doesn't matter that the information presented is untrue. Most people will act accordingly because they've all received the same disinformation about themselves. This second example, the demoralization example, this is precisely what white oppressive forces are doing to Black people. Keeping us believing the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves is how they now prevent us from unifying ourselves against the white oppressive society. Whenever those in power want to brainwash a targeted population to think and behave as they want them to, they always heavily demoralize them. This divides them, makes them self-loathing, and makes them much more easier to control. This is the Nefarious psychological warfare program. It works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave millions of Black people. Here's a basic example of how it works, okay? Imagine that a crew was out at sea aboard their well-functioning ship, and that their ship was being followed by a second ship. A second ship constantly broadcasting derogatory messages towards the first ship's crew. Such messages telling them that their ship was lesser, not seaworthy, perhaps slowly sinking, or that their crew was incompetent. With time, the crew constantly receiving these negative, demoralizing, degrading messages about themselves, being unable to refute nor confirm them, will grow weary, paranoid, and will eventually come to accept the negative assessments about themselves. This will eventually cause the targeted crew to become distrustful of each other, self-doubtful of each other, hateful of each other, doubt their own ability, and become self-loathing. The targeted crew may even become so besieged by deep feelings of inadequacy and resentment toward their fellow crew members that they may jump into the sea and attempt to swim towards the taunting ship, now believing it is the better one, even if their ship was in fact the better one. This entire process was accomplished by constantly inundating the ship's crew with negative, demoralizing disinformation about themselves. Its weapon was the negative messages and the way that the negative messages affect the targeted crew. It is a process with the objective to erode the morale of a targeted population through continuous demoralization. By destroying their morale, it can even prevent their will to fight against their enemies. It's very effective. No group can be constantly inundated with negative, demoralizing information about themselves and not suffer some adverse effects. Within a real world setting, the same demoralizing, divide and rule psychological warfare tactics is what's presently being deployed against Black people by the white society. And it's not hard to see. Can you see how cartoonishly unrealistic it actually is that all information we receive from the white society about us are negative? The reality is the white society writes all of our narratives. They literally owns our interpretation of ourselves. And they've weaponized this fact by keeping us believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves. This system is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects Black people to receiving only the fraudulent worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent Black racially demoralizing propaganda is being pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the Black population without being challenged nor counterbalanced by any equal amount of Black positive racially affirming information. It conveys the subliminal message that Black people are our own worst enemies and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that Black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when Black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. Its weapon is the demoralizing message that it carries and the way that it adversely affects the black people in terms of our behaviors. With time, being unable to refute the constant negative information being told about ourselves, many black people eventually comes to accept it. They internalize it. Many black people then experience profound feelings of humiliation and ask ourselves, why can't we get our act together? Why can't I get our act together? This unrelenting humiliation then causes many black people to become demoralized, divided, self-loathing, and resentful towards their own racial group. This is the true reason why millions of black people now perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies and revere as Caucasians in spite of a brutal history to the contrary. In the most extreme cases, many black people will even attempt to disassociate themselves from other black people. Psychologists call this disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and from the pain that they keep being black, being denigrated all the time. Some will make it their personal mission to go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. This is all possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving people certain information every so often, and you can steer an entire generation towards an implied objective. Most of us believe that the media reflects our reality, but in fact, it's rarely ever the case. The media most often forms our behavior, shapes our belief, affects our perceptions. And the white society controls the media content that's been fed into our minds, and they use it as a weapon to control us. Because perceptions created by the media leads to non-deliberate thoughtful decisions making or decision below the level of consciousness. It has been called thinking without thinking, and it ultimately leads to unconscious similar behaviors. Those black people that insist that they confirm their negative assessment about our racial group based upon their own individual experiences are in fact delusional, because it's not humanly possible for any individual to accurately assess the collective state of millions of people based upon their own experiences. It's not humanly possible. Those false negative perceptions about our racial group were deliberately embedded into our minds by the white society who controls all information about us. Keeping us demoralized, divided, and self-loathing is how they maintain their social dominance over us. The reason why many black people insist that they confirm their negative assessment about our racial group, although they've in fact not, is because once a false belief has been successfully embedded into the human mind, the individual will then only notice those incidents that appears to confirm the embedded belief and become psychologically blinded from seeing the great amount of evidence that refutes the embedded belief. Because we want to be religious rather than intelligent, we are easy victims of those who've studied how to hijack the human mind. Here's an example of how this works. If you believe that all Asian drivers are bad, because you've heard that propaganda, once it's embedded inside your mind, a person will only notice those Asian drivers who fits the embedded belief. You'll notice the Asian drivers had an accident, the Asian drivers getting a ticket. And you'll tell yourself that, yes, I've seen it for myself, that all Asian drivers are bad. But in reality, you're blinded by the millions of excellent Asian drivers. And the person will then insist that they've seen it with their own eyes, that all Asian drivers are bad, even though it's not true. It's an inherent flaw within the human psyche. And likewise, this same inherent flaw within the human psyche has been exploited by white social scientists and propagandists to trap the minds of millions of black people in a state of self-contempt. They indoctrinate beliefs, negative beliefs about ourselves, and now we only see those things that appears to confirm the embedded belief, creating self-hatred. We then only notice those incidents that appears to confirm the belief. And we will insist, and we'll start fighting against our own people saying that the propaganda is true, when it is not. We are psychologically blinded from seeing all the evidence that refutes it. This psychological warfare system provides the white societies with a more proficient method for controlling black people, given that it isn't easily recognized nor easily comprehended by its black victims. For unlike the past blatant racist systems that black people were easily able to identify and therefore develop counter strategies against, this system is not easily recognized nor easily comprehended by its black victims. And white racism always prevails best when the black victims are unable to recognize it. This psychological warfare works so well, in fact, that it not only makes black people more compliant with white dominance over our lives, it in fact causes millions to even prefer white dominance over our lives. It's at the root of both the profound feelings of self-hatred and division that are affecting many black people, and it's also at the heart of the internalized false feeling of superiority that many whites possess. This is the hidden reality that we must function based upon. We must educate our people. You see, this system works well because the oppressed will always believe the fraudulent worst about themselves. Franz Fanon said that. This isn't some feeble-minded conspiracy theory. It's the truth that most black people have been brainwashed not to realize. Those who know must teach